So my name is Jim Schrumpsel. I'm the Regulations and Enforcement Officer at Autonomy Conservation. Been there for a little over a year now. I was actually at Kawartha Conservation as their compliance officer since 2018. So combined about 6 years experience working in this field, doing ESC inspections and issuing permits with conditions related to ESCs.
My name is Will Chappell. I recently took over as the permitting analyst for Kawartha Conservation. My background is in the restoration side and some land use planning, and I'm really happy to be part of the team and working on things like permit application processing, prescribing conditions related to ESC for permits and things of that nature. So when you're looking to apply for a permit for any work that's close to a regulated feature, your first step would be to determine which conservation authority has jurisdiction over the property that you're proposing work at. So your first step would be to go to the Conservation Ontario website and check out their Find a Conservation Authority tool. It's an interactive mapping tool that allows you to place your property within which conservation authority has jurisdiction over it. So once you've determined which conservation authority you'll be dealing with for your permit application, your next step would be to determine if your property is actually regulated, which means that it would require a permit. So conservation authorities regulate features including watercourses, wetlands, unstable soils, and erosion hazards such as steep slopes. So if you have none of those features adjacent to your property, it's possible that you won't require a permit from the conservation authority even if you're within our jurisdiction. So if you determine that you're within the Kawartha Conservation watershed, you would check out our website for online property mapping or submit a property information request form to determine if your property is regulated and if you'd require a permit. On the Autonomy Conservation side, you can check out their interactive floodplain mapping tool or submit an online property inquiry form to determine if you'd require a permit.
And I'll also add to that we're going to be catching up with Kawartha soon, and you'll be able to apply for a permit directly through the website and also make your payment through there easier, just to make it a lot easier to get through the process.
So on the Kawartha Conservation side, permit application requirements include a complete permit application form. If you're applying through our website using an online form, the form does include these 3 items: a location map showing nearest intersections, a detailed letter or report describing the proposal, and the volume in cubic meters or yards and origin, so the company name or location, from any fill material that's being imported to the site. This includes granular sand topsoil, and it does not include any poured concrete or backfill native to the site. If you're applying in person or with a paper application form, you would need to meet these 3 requirements as well. We'd also require a deed or tax bill to prove ownership, a registered plan or survey if it's available, and 1 set of plans or drawings. If the applicant is not the owner, we also require signed authorization from the owner to the applicant that they approve of the applicant applying for a permit on their behalf. For larger infrastructure projects, commercial, industrial, and multi-residential, we do require an erosion and sediment control plan to be submitted at the time of the permit application. For more minor works, it's not necessarily a requirement, but we do appreciate when people include that with their permit application. So for standard permits for minor works, for sediment and erosion control, we would request that sediment and erosion control be appropriate to the site conditions and the nature of the proposal. And at a minimum, these are the conditions that you may see on your permit. We would ask that you install a row of silt fencing between the disturbed areas and any natural features, which may include water bodies such as lakes, watercourses, or wetlands, or even the crest of the steep slope on your property. We would request that you limit vegetation removal to the areas strictly required to accommodate the permitted works. Stabilize or revegetate all disturbed soil surfaces immediately upon completion of the permitted works, and minimize sediment release during decommissioning of sediment and erosion control measures. And in general, we would request that no sediment be allowed to leave the property, or in the case of larger development applications, the overall work site. For shoreline alteration permits, we did have some content about that today, but I'll go over what we would require from the Kawartha Conservation side for a permit application. There are some additional requirements for these types of applications, in addition to the other ones that I previously went over, including color photographs of the entire shoreline, generally taken in summer so we can get an idea of the existing site conditions. and also a proposed shoreline cross-section. So I see that it's a little bit blurry here, so I'll run through this a bit. So this is an example of a permissible cross-section for your shoreline using armor stone and sloped rock. Armor stone is not required, as some of our presenters have explained today, for shoreline erosion protection. It is more of an aesthetic piece. Oftentimes, sloped river rock or riprap is enough to adequately stabilize your shoreline. Generally, we would put conditions on the permit that the armor stone is set back at least 1 meter from the high water mark, and that sloped rock is placed on a minimum 2-to-1, but 3-to-1 where feasible slope. In terms of erosion and sediment control measures for shoreline alteration permits, they do vary. Generally, if you're in the Kawartha Conservation watershed, you would need a permit from Parks Canada or Trent Severn Waterways, and we would kind of work with you to use those requirements that they would give to your proposal and include that as a condition on our permit. Generally, that could be things like turbidity curtains, silt fencing, etc. And we may also request that additional on-land measures are installed as well, assessed on a case-by-case basis.
So if the property you're working on or your property is located within the Autonomy Conservation Watershed and you're within a regulated area within those features that Will had mentioned earlier, you might require a permit from us. So if you're applying for a permit, the minimum requirements for the application package includes a permit application form, landowner authorization form, and as Will mentioned, it's the same for us. If you're applying on behalf of the landowner, you can submit this form. Also include a site plan, and on the site plan include details such as property boundaries, any existing roadways or access roads such as the driveway, existing and proposed buildings or structures, if there are any new structures going into your shoreline or anywhere else on the property. The location of any of the natural features such as wetlands, water courses, shorelines, floodplains, steep slopes, or any other natural hazards. Just simply labeling them on the site plan is good enough. And for autonomy, we also want to know the distance from the proposed work to the property boundaries, as well as the distance from the proposed work area to the natural features on site. And we also do ask for a location and type of sediment erosion control measure proposal, or that's proposed on site. And you can also include either a text on the site plan itself to say what the installation details are, or a separate document can be provided outlining that. And if there's any vegetation to be removed on site, such as trees, shrubs, or any other type of vegetation, if that's going to result in bare soils or exposed areas, we do usually want to say revegetation plan for those areas. And this is just an example of the site plans that we look for. You can see the lot lines are there. It shows where the feature is on the bottom there, so a water course or a shoreline for the applications that we're discussing today. For the conditions, a lot of them are fairly similar to what the conservation asked for. So just sediment erosion controls installed and maintained in good working order, and that those ESCs remain in place until all site conditions are stabilized. And also keep in mind that once we do inspections on site, we may also ask that additional controls are installed depending on the site conditions. Again, disturbed areas are seeded, sodded, or stabilized in another manner that's acceptable to Orca staff. And that has to be done as soon as possible, but at the very least before the permit expires. And site disturbance should be limited to the area required for the work. No filling or encroachment of construction equipment or materials into adjacent natural areas, streams, floodplains, wetlands, or valley lands, or any other regulated features. And also to keep in mind that it is the proponent's responsibility to inspect the erosion and sediment controls daily throughout the project and maintain them until the conclusion of the project. And this includes removal of accumulated sediment whenever it's necessary. So over here we have an example of the cross-section drawings that we look for. And if you're doing shoreline alterations, that is an additional requirement for the permit application package. With that, we like to see the existing and proposed profile of the shoreline. There you can see what the existing one was and how the shoreline's going to be cut out. We look for a minimum of 3-to-1 slope since that's considered a stable slope for us. Limestone-based materials, this includes armor stone in most cases. Those have to be located above the high water mark. So for instance on here, it's a little bit faded, but it is there. So that would be your high water mark. Armor stone's located up here, or it could even be embedded into the shoreline anywhere along here, as long as you have slope rock in front to provide that erosion protection or shoreline stabilization function. On your site plan, you should also include the location and length of the shoreline area to be altered. And similar to Kawartha, we also do ask for photos of the current state of the shoreline, just to show how eroded it is and to show the need for erosion protection. If that's not possible, say it's winter and there's good snow cover, we can come out and do a site visit just to check on the status of the shoreline. There are also cases where we may ask for additional requirements like technical reports. That includes slope stability studies or environmental impact studies. A slope stability study would only be required if you're working up in the riparian zone or even the upland area and you do have a steep slope on site. We would just want to make sure that after the work is completed, that the shoreline and the slope itself will remain stable or won't cause an additional erosion hazard. Environmental impact studies could come into play if you have wetlands either on the property or adjacent. This actually does happen quite often for shoreline properties where you have marsh areas within the water body itself. So with the environmental impact study, we're mostly looking to make sure that the work is not going to impact the wetland in any way, specifically with the hydrologic function of the wetland.
I just want to add as well, as far as the technical reports for the Kawartha conservation side, we may request this after processing the permit application, after review of the application and the nature of the proposed works, depending on what type of regulated feature is present and what buffers are available on the property.
So some of the erosion sediment control measures that autonomy conservation might ask for shoreline alterations are heavy-duty silt fence barrier. This is generally installed between any exposed soil areas in the water body. It's generally only going to apply if you're doing any work in the upland or riparian zones, not necessarily on the shoreline itself. We just want to make sure that those areas are going to be isolated, no chance for silt or sediment to travel into the water body itself. If there are any water course outlets on the property, or even just working around water courses in general, we sometimes ask for a straw bale flow check dam. And that's to be constructed within the water course and between the work site and the outlet to downstream receiving areas. And those are to be maintained until all disturbed surfaces have been revegetated. There are additional options we can look at for that. I always do encourage applicants to come and discuss any other additional options they want to look at, whether it'll be a filter sock or if they do want to go with the straw bale flow check dam or even a rock flow check dam. We always kind of look at what the best fit is going to be on site and what the needs are going to be on site once construction starts and picking out the appropriate ESC for that. So some other applicable measures that we do tend to use quite often are light-duty straw bale barriers. Those can sometimes be used instead of silt fence barriers, or they can even be used in conjunction. So you can have a multi-barrier approach there with the straw bale barriers butted up against the silt fence barriers. And with turbidity curtains, I think we've touched on that quite a bit today, so just to isolate any water work areas. The only time I can think that you might need to use that is if you're working outside of the... Okay, we're not going as quick as I thought. We touched on turbidity curtains, we can go past that point today. So for permanent inspections, these are completed on a routine basis or in response to complaints. They're usually used to determine compliance with the permit conditions and the approved plans, to inspect erosion and sediment controls, and to identify any deficiencies within those controls, and also to assess the current site conditions to identify if there are additional measures in order to contain sediment and silt on the site. So the process that we go through prior to the inspection, an officer will always reach out to the landowner and the applicant to notify them of the date and time of the inspection. In some cases, they may also be informed of the reason for the inspection. And it's important to note that only the works outlined in the permit itself will be inspected. During the inspection, the officer may request to see that a copy of the permit is on site and available to anybody working on the site. And they'll also go through the authorized works to see the progress and inspect them in general, and make some notes on where that is, whether a follow-up inspection will be required at the the end of the project or not. Also to inspect the ESC measures for proper installation, note any deficiencies, and again to assess the site conditions. After the inspection is completed, the landowner and the applicant can expect to receive an inspection report from the officer on site. And in that report, they'll outline any deficiencies or any requests that they have of the landowner or the applicant. And if there are any deficiencies detected on site, they will request immediate action to rectify those. So these are some of the deficiencies we look for. I'm sure you can see quite a few in there. So with the silt fence, we'll look to make sure that it's towed into the ground, there's no gaps between or below the fencing. We'll make sure that it's not overburdened with silt. Generally, we like to tell folks to clear out any silt accumulation when it reaches about a quarter or less up the silt fence. Filter socks, we'll check to make sure that they're staked in, sized appropriately, and depending on the application as well. Sometimes you may find, we find that they are stacked, create like a taller barrier. We'll check for gaps to make sure there's no silt traveling around and that it is being properly filtered through. With straw bale barriers and flow check dams, again, make sure they're staked in, used appropriately. No gaps between the bales themselves. They should be butted up against each other and that they're oriented correctly. Often we go on sites where straw bale barriers are used and we'll find that the twine is actually touching the ground. That can cause the bale to deteriorate faster. So you should orient them so that the twine is horizontal to the ground. And then with turbidity curtain, again, if that's in use on site, we'll make sure that it's being used appropriately. There's the appropriate length and depth for the work area. And we usually like to see it butted up against the shoreline, especially since there'll be that gap underneath. In this type of application where it's used on the lakes to allow any fish or any other species to make their way out.
So there are a number of other provincial or federal agencies that you may require permission or approval from before beginning your proposed project. So for example, the Trent Severn Waterway Parks Canada would require permits or approvals for in-water works. For low risk projects, generally their requirements are that water remains clean, turbidity is contained, and appropriate equipment is used for the job. And with any other permit application from the Conservation Authority side as well, that appropriate materials are clean and free of fines and silt. For larger complex projects, there would be specific conditions assessed on a case-by-case basis. There's also the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry to keep in mind when you're looking at developing. For shoreland projects, you may require a permit for filling or dredging shorelands, placement of structures where the contact of the structure and the shoreline is greater than 15 square meters, and the removal of aquatic vegetation on your property. For more information, we really encourage people to check with their local MNRF office to determine if a permit or approval is required from them.
I will just add on that slide that within Kawartha and Autonomy's watershed, you're generally not going to run into this requirement. But I do know that a lot of service providers around here will service further north as well, where you're running into Crown land, and if you're adjacent to Crown land, there is a chance that you might have some permit requirements. So it's always best to check in with them. But their information is pretty easy to find online if you just search Crown land work permits. It also covers shorelands as well.
And lastly, there's the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada that may be interested in giving you permission or approving your works. For works, undertakings, or activities that may result in harm to fish or fish habitat, which includes work in water or adjacent to water, you'd want to reach out to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and they may have provisions related to sediment and erosion control that they would apply to your proposal. There are restrictions for activity due to fish timing windows. Generally, March 15th to July 15th is when that would occur. And you can complete a self-assessment to determine if approval will be required from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada by visiting the Government of Canada website, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, Aquatic Ecosystems and Projects in Water.
And with the previous presentation, kind of made me think about this. So we're mostly talking about works that are occurring on the lakes within the watershed. So if you're working within water courses where there's going to be trout habitat, there's going to be different timing windows that apply to those. And in summary, when starting work near water, it's always best just to contact your local conservation authority, just to check in on any permits or approvals that may be required. And it's also important to note that we really don't mind you guys calling. We we don't mind helping you out with the permit application process, answering any questions that you have, making sure that you understand what the conditions are gonna be on your permit, and also any other requirements that you might run into. After you've spoken to us, it's also good to talk to any other provincial, federal agency that has jurisdiction over the area you're working in. We've touched on quite a few of those, just to check for permits and approval requirements. And it's also good to understand the installation and maintenance of the erosion and sediment controls that would be required through your permit, or even additional controls that might be decided at a later point once works are underway on the site and staff have a better understanding of where sediment and silt are traveling and where the concerns are going to be. And it's also really important to think about having an inspection or maintenance schedule once the work is started on site so that you can stay ahead of any of the sediment erosion concerns that might come up. So in that, thank you for your time, guys, and thank you so much for attending today. If you have any questions for myself or Will, just fire away.